Welcome to Survivor Talks, a place where we tackle serious topics around sexual assault in the church with passion, hope, and laughter.
We're Kate and Laura. We're friends, survivors, and followers of Jesus, and we're excited to welcome you to our whole and redeemed community. Whether you are a survivor, an ally, or a church leader, there is a seat at the table for you.
So pull up a chair, get curious, and join the conversation. Before we begin, we want to remind you that this podcast deals with the topic of sexual violence, so there may be some triggering topics discussed. Please check the show notes for specific trigger warnings, and remember to take care of yourself during and after listening.
And as a reminder, we are not mental health professionals, so this podcast is not intended to substitute for professional help.
Welcome back, everyone, to Survivor Talks. We are so excited to be having another episode, and so excited to have you listening. And we'd love to share a quick, tiny little update. Kate moved to Arizona. You want to give us a few sentences about that?
We're excited to be starting the podcast up again. It's definitely been a minute, and a lot of that has been because I moved to a whole other state.
Yes, we miss her in Denver.
Yes. So now we are doing all of our recordings on Zoom for the foreseeable future. Unless Laura, moves to join me, just putting it out there.
No pressure.
No.
It's tempting when I look out my window at all the snow.
I feel that. I can only imagine. So I moved. I'm now in Arizona and moved to start doing college ministry down here, which I was already doing in Denver. Same ministry, just now in Arizona. And it's been really great. Absolutely love the community I found down here. We're excited to get back started with. We have literally so many podcast ideas.
Oh my goodness. Guys, in this meantime, we have been keeping our weekly meetings and planning so much stuff for you guys. We're so excited. And this episode is going to kick off our series on boundaries. And oh my goodness. We're probably going to have to cut ourselves short even with multiple episodes because I think I could talk forever about boundaries. But,
absolutely. Yep. Yeah, I think we will have our classic chronic problem of not being able to stop talking, really, which is a good problem.
Yep.
So
it is. Hopefully you guys agree.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And the plus side of having to do it on Zoom is that now we have audio or video that we can record for you guys.
Yes.
So hopefully, if everything works out technologically, this episode will be up on YouTube with visuals as well. You might catch a glimpse of my dog walking in the background. So
yes, he's so cute.
Thanks. Yes, I guess we haven't done a podcast episode since I got a dog, so that's my little life update. Mm-hmm. His name is Rocky. He's a pit bull mix, and he is both the love of my life and the bane of my existence. I wouldn't change anything for the world, so hopefully you guys will get to catch a glimpse of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to kick off today just kind of doing a bit of boundary basics or intro to boundaries and just kind of laying the foundation for the rest of the series. So we're really excited for that.
No, I think it's just, it's relevant to anyone, really. And I think especially for survivors, it is something that hits home so much and something that is really, it comes up in so many areas, of the life of a survivor, I think. So, definitely good. And I guess, Laura, you have kind of done a little bit more have a little bit more knowledge of like boundary stuff. I know you've actually read the book Boundaries. I have tried several times and never gotten past the first few chapters. And I don't know what that says about me, but here we are.
Yes. Well, hopefully, if any of y'all listening are in the same boat, this can be a little bit of like the spark notes of, and the book we're talking about is literally, it's just called Boundaries, and it's co-written by two Christian therapists named Henry Cloud and John Townsend, and I am not exaggerating when I say it changed my life. It did so by turning my life upside down, but it definitely changed my life for the better, and would highly recommend reading the book. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today is going to be from the book, or at least a lot of stuff I'll talk about from today will be from the book. And it can be very dense. It can be very overwhelming. The very first chapter was, it's a day in a boundaryless life. And I remember I got through that chapter, and it just sort of gives, like, an example of, like, okay, you know, I don't know, let's say her name is Susie. I don't remember the name that they make up. And they just make up a person, and they're like, she wakes up and does this and does that, and just sort of goes through her specific day. And I read it, and I was like, I told my mentor at the time, I was like, I'm pretty sure that this was supposed to be, like, a hyperbole of, like, a completely boundaryless life.
Oh, no.
But I was like, this is how I'm currently living my life. And I think that's part of why it took me a while to get past the first chapter, because I was like, that's rude. That's so rude.
I can believe that.
Yes. Well, to kick us off, I'd love to just sort of define, like, what are we talking about when we're talking about boundaries? Which I think partially we'll elaborate on, like, as we go through this episode, but
for sure.
The, like, sort of basic definition of boundaries is basically telling us where we end and where others begin. And so really defining that line. And I think that Henry Cloud and John Townsend do an amazing job of, like, giving this metaphor, which is basically if you have your property, like, we have a lot of physical properties. We're very good at, like, geographical boundaries, you know?
Yeah.
You think of, like, a neighborhood, you can pretty much tell, okay, that is that person's yard and that's another person's yard and things like that. Especially, like, in a backyard, you've often got fences. And so talking about, like, our boundaries are like those fences, and they talk about, like, it's important that we have gates in those fences, you know, so that we can let the bad things out of, like, you know, if you've got some trauma that you need to process with someone else, like, we're built for community, you know? Like, if you imagine, like, maybe somebody's houses that, like, back up to one another or something like that, and if they had, like, a gate that opened straight into somebody else's yard, you know what I mean? Of just sort of this space of, like, you want to be able to let the bad things out, to be able to process with other people, things like that. And you want to be able to let the good things in, of accept help and accept, like, you know, comfort and things like that from others. And so we need these gates, but these fences say, okay, this is my property line, this is your property line, and it sort of delineates that and starts that off. And I think that is, like, a really helpful metaphor for me of, like, picturing, okay, this is what boundaries look like.
Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful. I feel like it's really hard to define where that line is, especially when you haven't been living with boundaries.
Yes, exactly. It's a fine, like, theoretical concept, but when you don't go into, like, more detail, it's like, okay, like, what, like, where do you put the fence, you know? Right. And I think there's so many things that I think are really important about, like, being like, okay, this is what boundaries are and are not, but one thing that's really helpful is Galatians 6, and we have a post about it, a few posts probably amongst our platforms, about this, especially when I was first reading the book. But Galatians 6 really sheds a lot of light on this topic. And so it's Galatians 6, 2 through, I'm not sure exactly how far it goes, but it says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And then you go down to verse 4, it says, but let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load. And if you look at the Greek in that, the word for burden is basically like this boulder. It's this thing that you like cannot carry on your own. You know, we're talking poverty, we're talking trauma, like these are things that it's like it takes a village, like versus the word for load where it says in verse 5 like each person must carry their own load. It's sort of this word that means like your daily tasks. And so Henry Cotton John Townsend say it's sort of like this boulder versus like a knapsack, you know, like you can carry your own knapsack. And things that might come into that category of a knapsack are like, you know, and you know what, these are going to vary by culture. They're going to vary by like so many different factors. But like some things that might be more universal are like, hey, Laura Anderson is in charge of Laura Anderson's emotions. Like, you know, and I can like get support from my therapist, get support from my friends and things like that. But like, if like it sort of flies in the face of the phrase that we like to use a lot of like, that person made me mad, you know, and kind of turning that around of like, and it sounds like semantics, but it's very important, you know, like, hey, when that person said blah, 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 like, I felt really angry. And so not denying the fact that you feel angry, you know, like, and not denying that that was a direct result of the thing that the other person said, you know, but that they aren't making you angry. Like, you're responsible for your emotions. And I think it's so hard because you can take it too far in the one or the other direction. Like, you know, if you're listening to this and you've grown up in a very evangelical, like, Christian culture, like, my hope for you would be that you would learn that boundaries are not selfish and that boundaries are really beautiful and learn how to like advocate for yourself. And my hope for you, if like you're sort of on the other side where it's like, I think something I've encountered as I've learned about boundaries is there can be this like, especially I've heard this talked about that a lot of white therapists will encourage people of color that are their patients like, hey, you just need to like, you know, go no contact or cut that person out of your life or things like that, and can kind of go on the extreme side. So I think it's perpetuated by white supremacy for sure. But I think it's this thing that's floating around, especially I think secular spaces in the conversation around boundaries, where it's like, at least we're having the conversation about boundaries, but like I think it can be really quick to be like, oh, you know, 0 to 100. And so learning, I think in both ways, like finding that nuance, you know, which is, it's tough. It's a tough balance, but
no, it's so true. I think that's a good point that like when we're thinking about the idea of boundaries that like, I mean like it's very easy to want to make that a black and white thing. And I think especially if you haven't been living with boundaries or if you've had boundaries crossed, then like once you suddenly like have the permission to like, and you're like kind of gaining confidence to be like, like I'm gonna set boundaries, it's easy to want to go like 0 to 100 and be like, no,
yes,
I'm just gonna cut everyone out and like nothing is safe.
Yep.
And like
there was definitely no point in my journey where I did that.
No. Yeah. But so I think like that, like reminding ourselves and like just that there is so much nuance, and especially like depending on your culture, on like each circumstance, each relationship that you're talking about. There's so much to navigate there.
Yes. Absolutely. Another misconception like that I would love to like clarify before we jump into talking about like how we've explored boundaries and things like that and how that applies to survivors, is I've seen a lot of people come at boundaries of like, okay, you know, let's take COVID as an example. I mean, it's a very salient one. Like, like people saying, you know, okay, my boundary is that we can't hang out unless you're vaccinated. That's a fine. If that's where your boundary is at, that's where your boundary is at. You know, and like I think where the misconception comes in is like. And I find myself doing this so much of like, oh, like they're doing the wrong thing. Like they didn't just go get vaccinated, you know? Like I want them to like, like I want them to be vaccinated. This like, and feeling like the purpose of the boundary is to be like, this is what you have to do, you know? I totally get that impulse. For anyone who's familiar with the Enneagram, I'm an Enneagram 1. I very much like to tell other people what to do, and it's rarely healthy. And so I totally relate to that impulse. And, like, what boundaries are is, like, hey, this is what I'm allowing on my, like, side of the fence. You know what I mean? So, like, if you say, like, hey, we can only hang out, like, if you're vaccinated and the person chooses not to get vaccinated, then like you don't get to hang out with them, and that sucks. Like, and it makes you I think something I've been walking through is like thinking about like, oh, that makes me think about like what I want to set as a boundary, you know, because I think there's a step before a boundary, which is simple communication of like, hey, this is what, you know, like if I were in that situation, you know, it'd be like, hey, I would really feel more comfortable if you would be vaccinated before we hung out, you know, might be my first step, you know,
totally.
And then would go to a boundary of like, hey, I'm only going to hang out with you if, depending on where your comfort, like if it is straight out the get-go, you know, like for whatever reason that you're like, hey, like this is a hard and fast rule for me, like there's some that I'm not going to ease into, you know, like I definitely have certain things where I'm like, there's no middle ground. Like, you know, if you're physically harming me, I'm going to remove myself from the situation. Different things like that, you know? So I think that is like a really important piece that I've encountered as I talk to people about boundaries. And yeah, just wanted to like throw that out there.
Yes. No, that's such a great point. I feel like, especially for people that like, I feel like I'm going to continue to talk about like people who have a hard time setting boundaries, which is probably like, you know,
we learn things from that.
That's because, you know, I think that's the experience that we both relate to. And it's probably one that a lot of survivors relate to. But yeah, like I think in that experience, like so often, like a lot of things feel out of your control, and a lot of relationships and like all of that stuff like is so like out of your control, or like people aren't treating you the way that they should, or whatever it is, and so it's like really frustrating to like, you want to like make people treat you better, and you like, and you want to like, you just want better things, but you can't make other people like change if they don't want to, and especially like sometimes you turn around and look at the people that you've let into your life that you maybe shouldn't have or didn't want to, but you did, and now you're having to look back in hindsight and be like, man, now I need to like set a new standard for who I am and like who I want to be treated, how I want to be treated. And that's really hard, and not everyone's going to be on board with that.
Super hard. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Kate, you know this, but my journey of setting boundaries definitely looked a lot like that. And it's tough. It's really tough. Like, and there's a grieving process. That's really important. Of like realizing like, hey, especially if your boundaries are like, hey, I want to be spoken to with respect. You know, like things that, you know, it's like, and
reasonable,
it's like,
bare minimum.
Yes, exactly. And no matter what your boundaries are, there's a measure of grief when it's like, hey, these are things that are high value to me. And relationship is high value to me too. And so to be in that space of like having to prioritize which value is most important and potentially losing relationships because of protecting yourself and things like that can be really painful and takes creating space for yourself to grieve.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's so important.
Yeah. I'd love to hear you share, Kate, just a little bit like what has your journey been like in incorporating boundaries into your life?
Yeah. That is a great question. Well, I am definitely a chronic people pleaser.
Can't
relate at all. And so, and I think like, I just really like to be liked. And so, and I'm so, and like, I am an Enneagram 2. So I really like to be the helper. I like to be like the person, like I want to sacrifice my own needs for the sake of others and like, manipulatively, honestly, in a way, get love that way.
The Enneagram's not flattering.
It's not, but here we are. Because I couldn't possibly be loved for being myself. That's ridiculous.
That's crazy.
But yeah, so I think like for most of my life, I lived like pretty much like not having boundaries, like kind of just letting people walk all over me, and like had a lot, I think especially like through high school and middle school, like, you know, like these awkward years, and you're like social groups are weird, and like you feel so awkward, and so I think like just had a lot of instances where I just walk away from like interactions with people and just feel so bad, and like and not really know why and not know how to fix it. And so I think like that's one element of that. And I think like I also have noticed over my life like just taking on a lot of just responsibility for things that were not my responsibility. You know, it just with like especially people's emotions, I think that is a big one that is very hard to like distance myself from, especially like the uncomfy emotions. Like anytime anyone got mad or sad, even now, like I still get this instant like panic moment in my head where I'm like, oh no, I need to fix this. This is my responsibility to fix this person's emotion. Like, and that's not true, but I still believe it.
Correct. Yeah, it's a lot of unlearning to do throughout our lives.
Yes. But at least I'm at a point where I recognize that, like,
yes,
that's my thought process. Like,
it's a huge first step.
I know that that's the case. I just don't know how to quite get over the next hump of really believing that.
Fair.
So there's that. But yeah, I think like that, and I think like the last area of my life that like has had a lot of like struggles with boundaries has just been trying to what am I thinking? Yeah, just with like time and like committing, over committing to things. That is something I'm very guilty of doing, which I think is partially like this, like people ask me for things and I'm like, oh, I'm needed. Oh, how wonderful.
Yes.
And so I like notice that go through my head, and then I'm like, well, and I can't say no because like what if I say no and like now they're gonna use someone else, and like I don't know, like it just somehow in my brain it's like that means that I don't know, it's like
your value will go down or something like that.
Like takes away some love tokens or something, I don't know.
yeah
So
that's very relatable, I think, for a lot of us.
So I feel like especially like practically like even in like in this new job, you know, like it's a new scenario, so I'm still like really insecure, you know, you kind of have that like constant imposter syndrome for like your first like 6 months at a new job at least. And so I think I notice myself like overcommitting and saying yes to a lot of things to like earn my love into this place, which of course is not true at all. Like my coworkers are wonderful people and they love me exactly as I am. But like that I think is definitely a big driver right now in like why I'm not setting better boundaries in my commitment levels at the moment. So yeah, those are kind of some things for me.
Thanks for sharing. Absolutely. Like I feel like work is a really hard arena too. There's just so much. There's power dynamics, and there's like so much of us get our sense of self-worth from the work that we produce, and there's just like a lot on the table. So that makes sense. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, how about you, Laura?
Yeah. I mean, I relate to so much of your story, Kate. Like, I definitely have always been, like, someone who's working to, like, sense what are the emotions in the room, and, like, and trying to fix them or, like, help make people feel better or things like that. And I was actually looking back, so for the past couple of years, not really recently, but up until about 6 months ago, I was very active on my Instagram story and would repost a lot of posts that spoke to me. And so I was going back through my archives because I was just like, I bet I could see a really cool picture of how I started, like, learning about boundaries. So I went back to January of 2019, and it was fascinating.
Wow.
I just was, like, mindlessly scrolling. And it was really, really interesting to see, like, I think that all of us have an area in our life where we are, I think it's really easy for a lot of us to be like, especially those of us who relate to people pleasing and things like that, to be like, oh, I just suck at boundaries, you know? Versus like, I think think that the truth of the matter is that we all have at least one area of our life where we have really strong boundaries that we really believe in, you know? And what I was noticing didn't always come easily to me, but I noticed that me sort of starting to, my journey of learning to really implement boundaries and clear boundaries, because I think a lot of times we can like have them internally, but to communicate them to other people is a whole other ball game.
Yes.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, I've struggled with disordered eating and all of that, and so a piece of that is intuitive eating that I've learned how to kind of heal. Intuitive eating is basically a philosophy of healing, and there's 10 principles, and one of the earlier ones is to reject the diet mentality.
Yes.
And diet culture. And those of you who know me in my personal life are well aware of that pillar, because I'll talk about it forever.
Down with the diet culture.
Yes, exactly. And so I noticed that as I was like, before I started really talking about boundaries, I was talking about rejecting diet culture, you know?
Yeah.
And I think what that taught me is that even if we're not necessarily calling it boundaries, there's, I think for many of us, if not all of us, there's some area of our life that you might not even think is an area where you're good at boundaries, because it's like, you wouldn't call it boundaries. It's just like, no, that's not okay, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that brings up another piece of boundaries, which is this aspect of like, of saying like, hey, every piece of information that's said about me as an individual, or that's said about me within, people group of being a woman or being, whatever, like, it has to go through a filter before I internalize it. I think that was not a boundary that I had for a long time. And I think with doing that simply with this one area of my life of like, hey, when people are telling me like that it's best that I have to lose weight to be healthy or beautiful or whatever, people were telling me that, like sugar is addictive and you shouldn't have more than half a banana in a sitting or whatever, all these ridiculous things.
Yeah.
Like being like, hey, let's start having a filter, and the things that people say about me have to go through a filter before they get internalized, and so I think that's sort of like what started my journey before I even realized I was starting my journey. And then was told by many people that I should read the book Boundaries, and after like 5 different people told me it, and then my aunt gifted it to me, I was like, okay, fine, I'll read it. And yeah, it was mind-blowing to me. Like literally like I said, I read the audiobook, and I would often listen to it while I was driving, and I would just sit there alone in my car with my mouth completely agape. I'd be like I would just pause the audiobook and just sit there with my mouth open, like shocked at what he had just said. Like just when he's talking about sometimes the sources of our lack of boundaries, and talking about what boundaries look like, and all of the biblical evidence, so much of Proverbs is actually talking about boundaries. And I'm like, how did I miss that? Like, it's crazy of like the types of people that you allow in your life or don't, and like that when someone is harming you to take refuge. Like, yeah,
I'm literally having the realization that you had all those that in that time.
When I was reading it, yeah. I know, it's crazy, and so
wow.
Please don't chew my basket. And for those of you who don't have visual, Rocky's chewing a basket on my desk.
Yep.
But yeah, so it is just really, really cool to just be able to be like, holy moly, there's so much biblical basis. And, like, even thinking about the fact that, like, the Trinity, like...
Yes.
When we talk about Trinitarian theology, like, we're talking about boundaries. Because, like, the reason that it's heretical to say that, like, Jesus is exactly the same as God and Jesus is exactly the same as the Father and the Holy Spirit, and rather than saying that they're three separate entities, but they are the same, I mean, it gets complicated when you talk about Trinitarian theology, but
even if the most like incredible theologians have a hard time saying it, then I think
it's okay if we can't articulate it perfectly. But if you think about that, like, the fact that they're three separate entities in relationship with one another, like, is because of boundaries, you know, like, because boundaries doesn't just mean, like, oh, I'm not going to talk to you again, or, you know, whatever. It's saying, like, hey, this is me, and that's you, and that's okay, you know? And, yeah, so that book was a huge, huge part of my journey.
Oh my gosh, that's wild. I'm still reeling from all of those thoughts.
Yeah. Fair. The Proverbs one, like, is just, it threw me for a loop. I had to go reread Proverbs because I was like, and that gets into a whole other conversation about, like, the way that scripture is read to us and, like, the tone with which it's read to us, because I think of boundaries as something that is kind and gentle and includes caring for ourselves as well as others. And I think the way that Proverbs has been presented to me by the enemy, like when I'm reading / like different church philosophies and things like that, or specific interpretations, like, we read it as, at least I have read it as so harsh and rigid and, like, here are all the things you're doing wrong.
Right.
And, like, and that it's this, which it is, it's this fatherly advice, you know? And there's so much truth in it, you know, that's, like, not necessarily easy to swallow, and there's no way around that. But there's also so much gentleness and, like, attention to how God calls us to steward our own souls, our own bodies, as well as the world that he's put us in, you know? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm definitely really, really interested to reread Proverbs now in that light, because I definitely relate to that of, like, I think, like, just, I mean, Proverbs and just so much of scripture I've always seen as, like, this really rigid, like, don't do this is bad, and, like, these things are good. And I mean, like, there certainly are certain areas of life, like, don't kill people, that, like, you know, is pretty black and white, but then, I mean, technically there's, like, war and, like, I don't even know, like, all of the dynamics of that.
There's so much nuance in everything.
Right. Exactly. But you're so right that, like, boundaries are, like, loving and they're good and gentle, and, like, at least they're gentle to, like, the person who's setting them for it. Like they're kind to ourselves, but they can feel like violence to someone who is on the receiving end of it, and that's not your responsibility to care for that. You know, especially if that is a really unhealthy person in your life. But, like, it is probably gonna hurt. That was just, like, a random, like, little tangent that came to mind. But
very true. Yeah, and I think that, like, as you were talking, it made me realize, like, an even better word might be than gentle might be kind. Like, boundaries can be almost, I think about a rock, like, you know, you're sort of standing your ground in a lot of ways. But they're kind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, this podcast is catered towards survivors. And so, you know, I guess, what stands out to you, what are things that, like, you think would be helpful for survivors to think about when trying to set boundaries?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main thing that stuck out to me was just talking about, Henry Cloud and John Townsend talk about when they're sort of setting up, like, these are what boundaries are. They talk about certain areas of our life that we, like, have boundaries that we can, with which we can set boundaries.
Yeah.
So, you know, they're talking about with our voice, we can set boundaries. With taking space, you know, we can set boundaries. With all of these different ways that we can set boundaries, whether it's your voice or with taking space from other people, like space away from other people. One that I think really stuck out to me was that skin is our very first and primary boundary, and it's a literal physical boundary between us and the outside world, us and germs, and us and so many different things. And as survivors, like, that boundary has really been crossed, you know? And that can make it really challenging to feel the ability, or, like, the ability to set boundaries, or even the worthiness to set boundaries when such, like, a basic level of boundaries have been broken. Especially for people who have experienced assault at a younger age in any sort of, you know, and even thinking about teenage years or things like that, you know, like, it really warps the way that you see yourself. And there's been so many studies on, like, how that affects how people walk through the world. And so if you're listening to this and you're like, holy moly, boundaries sound nice, but I don't know how to do it. First of all, we've barely scratched the surface.
Oh my gosh, honestly.
And it's like, it makes sense that boundaries would be tough for you when the most basic boundary of your own skin has been violated and you didn't really have a choice in the matter. And that's a really, really challenging place to be in. And if you're in that space, I just want you to know that you're not alone, and we're here with you. And healing is slow and nonlinear and frustrating, but it's possible, especially with the Holy Spirit and Jesus, you know, at our sides and going before us. And but how about you, Kate, as you think about, like, boundaries as they relate to survivors, and as a survivor yourself, like, what has that looked like, you know, as you navigate boundaries? How has that interacted with your experience?
I think it definitely is so messy, and and absolutely, like, I think I definitely relate to, like, what you said about, like, just, like, worthiness, you know, like, I think it can be, like, so easy to not feel worthy to set boundaries if they have been crossed. And and I think, like, I think maybe in my story a lot of it too is, like, not, like, feeling like, well, I tried to set boundaries and they were bulldozed over. You know? And so I think that can, like, result in a lot of, like, lack of confidence in even trying to set boundaries in the future. Because your trauma brain's like, well, it didn't work once.
What's the point?
So why bother?
Which is super valid.
Yeah.
It's not true, but
right.
It's very valid.
Right,
to feel that
right.
way. Yeah.
Yes, if you couldn't tell from my sarcasm.
Yeah,
exactly.
no,
exactly. It's so true. It's not true, and but it is so scary to when you don't have a positive narrative. And I think honestly, that's something where finding people that do love you and that do honor your boundaries, and maybe it takes some time to find who those people are. And maybe you have those people, but you're just so afraid to even test setting a boundary with them that you don't even know that they're a safe person.
Oh yeah, that's a really hard space to be.
But I feel even just in our friendship, Laura, I think I've seen a lot of healing for both of us in each of us setting boundaries with each other, and being really scared each time.
Yep. And it doesn't get much easier.
No, it really doesn't.
It eventually does, but it's hard.
But I think especially early on, it was really, really hard. But I think both of us were such safe spaces for each other, and both of us received those so well. And I think what was really helpful to hear was this affirmation. I just remember all these times that you would say to me, Laura, you would say to me Kate, thank you for saying something. And that is a totally reasonable thing to ask for. And I think those words were just really, really healing to hear. And I think affirmed this big fear of this maybe is unreasonable to ask for, and and this is terrifying, and maybe I'm just being dramatic, or making this all up in my head. So I think finding those people as a survivor that you can practice setting boundaries, because you're gonna need to do that with anyone in your life. That's just a normal part of healthy things. I feel I tend to associate boundaries with unhealthy situations, but no, boundaries are just normal parts of life. And any healthy relationship and any healthy experience and circumstance is going to have healthy boundaries implemented. So yeah, that's my advice, I think, for survivors, is just to practice that with people that love you, that can help and can model Christ's love to you in that. And I think that can get you more comfortable with maybe those scarier conversations, and get you more comfortable with this confidence level of I am worthy to expect at least the bare minimum.
Yes, exactly.
And honestly, maybe even more than that, dare I say it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that's just it. We're built for community, you know? And so it takes having, when you're talking about those affirmations, having people thank me for being vulnerable was such a huge, growth step, and such a huge help for me, and very healing, and so I think exactly what you're saying of finding those safe people, and and you know what, there's been times in my life where I didn't have anybody who was that safe person, and I think that's where counseling comes in, whether that's finding a licensed therapist, or if you have really great Christian counselors in your church, or whatever that looks like, somebody who's mental health informed, ideally somebody who's mental health informed and Christ-centered, can bring this healing, because that's the purpose, especially in a therapeutic relationship with a licensed clinician, is to mirror those relationships that you're gonna have in the quote-unquote outside world, and it's someone who's trained to respond well, and I know for any of y'all who have therapists currently, or who are thinking about finding a therapist or starting therapy soon, therapy, I had a huge breakthrough when I started realizing, like, oh, I could just be honest with this person, you know?
Yeah.
Like, this is, like, an actually safe person who I can say, like, hey, I didn't like the way you said that to me, or, you know? Or, hey, like, and to realize, like, that the proper response to that is, oh, I'm really sorry, how can I do better?
Mind-blowing.
Getting defensive, or yeah, exactly. Like, I was like, wait, what? And it's really scary taking that first step, you know, to be able to say, like,
yeah.
But honestly, another thing that inspired me was I used to work at a preschool in college, and these 4-year-olds were trained to know to say, and it was a formula for them, but it was better than how most adults handle conflict.
Yeah.
If let's say little Timmy comes up and he's like, Johnny hit me. I don't know. Johnny threw sand in my face. And like, and what you would do is you would walk over with little Timmy to Johnny, like, but you would just be there as support. And Timmy would know to say, Johnny, you did XYZ action, you threw sand in my face, and it made me feel XYZ. Sad, angry, whatever. Like, just to say that alone is, like, way more than any of us adults, or most of us adults, like, have the ability to say, like, hey, you did this action, and it made me feel this action, or as a result, I felt this action, you know? And then even more amazing was that Johnny would know to say, not just I'm sorry, especially because kids don't really understand what that means, but to say, like, how can I make it better? You know, like, do you need a hug? Do you need some space? You know, and the kids knew sort of like a little list of things that they could respond with, of like, I need a hug, I need some space, I need whatever. And, like, as adorable as that is, it's, like, such a good lesson. Like, I wish that every relationship in my life could look like that, you know?
Yeah.
And also to surround yourself with people who are good at setting boundaries. Like, I think that's, if you're looking to find friends or things like that, like, looking for people who set good boundaries with you. Yeah. Even when you don't like it, you know? Like, even to say, like, one reason that you, Kate, feel like such a safe person to me is that if I reach out and say, like, hey, I'm having a really hard time right now, I could use somebody to talk to, like, there have been times where you've said, hey, I don't have the spoons for that right now, like, which that goes into spoon theory, but I don't have the energy for that right now. And I don't have the energy for that right now. And like, and, you know, the first time that someone ever said that, I don't know that you were necessarily the first person to say that to me, but the first time someone said that to me, I was, like, sort of offended. Like, I was like, like, I just said I'm having a hard time. Like, that's, like, that was my framework for how relationships, like, romantic or not, like, worked, you know, of, like, if you text a friend and say that you need them, like, if they respond at all, it should be yes, let me call you, you know, like, but you and others who say that in my life, which thankfully now is most people in my life, like, feel like such safe people, because I know that when you're saying yes to that, you're saying it because you want to, and you have the ability to do so, versus people in my life who might say yes to, like, absolutely, and then it comes out in the conversation that they're dealing with their own stuff, and they're actually not able to hold space for me, and it makes us both feel worse. And oh my gosh, I would have been better off just being alone and learning how to deal with my own emotions on my own, because that's a valuable skill as well, you know? So that was a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's another important piece when we're talking about boundaries, is like, when you're looking for those people that might be safe people, looking for people who set good boundaries with you. And getting curious about your initial reaction to when they set boundaries with you. Because it's, if you're not used to operating that way, it's not going to feel good at all.
No, absolutely. That's so true. Yeah, I feel like thinking about that made me think of like two things of like one, just like our inner child. Like I think if it was if like as a child you were like denied, like boundaries were like, no, you can't do this, and like and like you just internalized, well, I need to do all these things for other people and not get my needs met. Like having a boundary put in your face can like, or like see like just like that can feel like honoring someone else's boundary feels like this little like 2-year-old wanting to be like, they get what they want and I don't get what I want. No.
Exactly. And for your inner child, that's a really valid response.
Right. Yeah. So I feel like that totally is like a part of that, like honoring that and like acknowledging like, hey, like that's totally valid. Like there's a lot of reasons to feel that way. And also I love what you brought up of like how ultimately safe you feel in relationships when everyone is honoring each other's boundaries, because like then like you are like, you like, I think especially for anyone who like worries about if people truly love them or if like there's like anything like that, you know, like when
are they secretly mad at me?
Yeah, exactly. Like all of any of those things, like am I a burden, whatever it is, like when you know that like the person that's like spending time with you is wholeheartedly saying yes, like like with good boundaries, like and you're also saying yes with good boundaries, like that's like so beautiful and like can really soothe those fears, because you know that everyone is wanting to be there.
Yes, absolutely. Which makes me think of two things. One of which is I can't wait till we talk about consent and boundaries, because just what you're talking about with this like wholehearted, enthusiastic yes, like just reminds me so much of language around that. Yes. And boundaries are such a pivotal piece of consent. And like, I'm not saying I have it totally figured out in the least when it comes to boundaries. But I have been through fire to hell and back, however you want to describe it. Yeah. And Kate's well aware of this, in the past year or so, really, really setting boundaries with people, and you know, and for some of my friendships that meant complete severing. That meant, okay, you know, we went from really, really close to getting coffee every once in a while, or, you know, it meant different things for my friendships, and it's been incredibly difficult, and it's not without sacrifice. And, like, what you were talking about, Kate, when you were talking, I think this is the first time that I've realized, like, I can't remember the last time I asked myself, are they secretly mad at me?
Wow.
Like, I can't remember the last time like, I can't remember the last time that I asked myself, like, ugh, like, do they really want to be here? Are they just saying it? You know, like, I feel so, with the people that I've, like, put around me, like, that I feel so confident in, like, the love that others give to me, and for a period of time, that shrunk my circle real small. But it's been built back up again, and these people probably won't be in my life forever. Our world is so transient now. People move and life changes, you know, but
especially in your 20s
right now. Oh my gosh, especially in your 20s. Like, it's unbelievable. It's something that I think my inner child, or especially my inner teenager, like, it would blow her mind. Like, you know, and it's like, I feel like watching, which we talked a little bit about inner child work, but like, there's so much more that we could talk about it as well. But watching your adult self, like, how proud I am of, like, myself, or like my inner teenager seeing, like, oh my gosh, I'm so proud, you know, like, it's just a shadow, a taste of how proud God is of us every single time he sees us set a boundary, you know? Like, we're called not just to, you know, like, serve other people endlessly. Like, our purpose ultimately is communion with God, you know? And obviously, like, loving others, like, is a huge, huge piece of that. Yeah. And, like, loving ourselves and making sure we're in a space to love other people well, like, is another huge part of that. And God seeing us make strides in those areas brings him so much joy and pride, and I'm just really excited for us and for anybody listening who's on a journey of setting boundaries. Like, I just want you to know that I am so excited for you and proud of you, and we would love to hear any wins that you have in this area, big or small. Like, send us a DM or leave us a comment or something like that, because it's hard work, but I would say I at least can see the light at the end of the tunnel, or feel like I've made it over the biggest hump that is in my journey, you know? So it's possible.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So true. So true. Yeah. Well, is there any other, like, final words that you want to say before we wrap up?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I sort of got on my soapbox with that last little bit, so I feel pretty good. How about you, Kate? Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I feel pretty good. I think, I'm excited for all of the future conversations we're going to have. We're going to be tackling, you know, how the church can be better in this area, especially like power dynamics in the church and navigating that. As you said, talking about consent. There's just so many areas of this that I think.
Boundaries with those around you as you're healing.
Yes.
Can be a really big one.
Yeah. Exactly. So, I think there's just so much good, and I loved what you said of just, I think how much healthier, like, when we focus on healing those, like, inner wounds, with boundaries and, like, making that a reality in our outer world, like, I think is a really powerful thing, and, like, is something that I've absolutely experienced God, like, being right alongside me through all of that. And I've seen that be really powerful in, like, my community and in my, like, just my relationships with other people. I think that just is really powerful. Super hard, as you said. But so good. So well, I would love to just close us in prayer.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah. Do you want to close us in prayer?
Yeah. I'll pray.
Perfect.
God, thank you so much for getting us to this new place of being able to record podcasts again. And I just pray that whoever's listening to this, that something resonated with them, and that whatever did, that you would just continue to kind of bring that up in their minds this week, and just whatever healing you want to do in their lives, and whatever scary conversations need to be had, or whatever that is. I just pray that you would be with them, and that you would take care of them in whatever losses might result from that, and that ultimately you would also give them just a vision of the beauty of the life that you're offering them, if they take these courageous steps in setting these boundaries. Just how much more life-giving their life will be on the other side of that. I lift up this amazing person that's listening to this podcast today, and just lift up this conversation and future conversations all to you. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for listening.
Yes.
We are so excited to be back.
Yeah.
And yeah, stay tuned for our next episode.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. We are so glad that you joined us for this episode. As always, please make sure to take care of yourself after listening, especially if you are a survivor or walking through any kind of trauma.
This is a brand new podcast, so if you like what you heard, please make sure to leave us a review and share this episode with your friends so that more people can hear us. And head over to our podcast notes for our website, social media platforms, and the link to the written transcription of this episode.